Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Yonit Arthur. I'm an audiologist and strength coach, and I specialize in vestibular disorders. Welcome to my channel, The Steady Coach. Today we're going to be talking about unilateral hypofunction, neuritis and labyrinthitis, and their connection to neural circuit dizziness. But before we talk about that, I want to quickly explain how your vestibular organs normally work. You have two vestibular organs, one in each ear, and they send information to the brain about how quickly you're moving, the direction of your movement, and they also provide information about gravity. Typically, your ears are balanced, so they're both sending very similar information to your brain. And they function in what we call a push-pull system, which means that your brain compares information coming in from each ear to determine exactly what's going on in your environment. So you can see how if your brain is predicting or expecting equal information from both ears, and then suddenly one ear drops off the radar, that could cause a problem. And indeed, that is what happens with unilateral hypofunction. Your brain is expecting equal or similar information from both ears, and one ear suddenly changes. The most common cause of this kind of dysfunction is neuritis or labyrinthitis. Neuritis refers to when the vestibular nerve is impacted by inflammation or infection, which means that the information from the sensory organ just isn't making its way into the brain the way it should. And labyrinthitis refers to when the actual vestibular organ is inflamed or infected, and therefore is also sending bad quality or less information to the brain than it normally does. In both of those cases, though, it results in this sudden unilateral hypofunction, one ear dropping off the map. And because your brain normally compares information from two ears that it's expecting to be equal, this is extremely confusing to your brain and can cause all sorts of symptoms. Typically, neuritis and labyrinthitis occur after a viral infection, sometimes even a cold or a flu. And it's thought that the virus causes inflammation, indirectly or directly attacks the inner ear. Because the drop is so sudden, the symptoms are extreme. People will often have very severe spinning vertigo that lasts for several days. They'll have nausea, they'll have a whole bunch of difficulty balancing, they'll have visual disturbances, and they'll just feel awful. That acute phase will normally clear up within about a week, but that can vary a little bit depending on when the inflammation starts to go down. And in many cases, people make a full recovery, the inflammation goes down, and the organs and nerve continue to work properly. But in some cases, there is a permanent change in the function of the nerve and or the actual vestibular organ. In both cases, though, your brain needs to go through a process of what we call compensation. And compensation refers to trying to rebalance its expectations of what's coming in from each ear. So as we've talked about in previous videos, your brain doesn't just interpret information from the senses, it predicts information that's coming in from the senses. So if it's going along and it's expecting both ears to work this way, and then suddenly one ear drops off the map, it has to adjust its templates. In other words, it has to adjust its predictions so that it knows, okay, this ear may be giving me a little bit different information from how it used to. And it can essentially rebalance how much weight it gives to each ear. If this is hard to understand, just think about a soundboard technician trying to balance two speakers. If one speaker is a little bit lower than the other, then that sound technician could turn up the master volume a little bit on just that speaker so that the sound is balanced. And this is essentially what your brain does in the process of compensation. Compensation occurs because of something known as neuroplasticity. And as we've discussed on this channel, neuroplasticity just refers to your brain constantly adapting to its environment. It's something your brain is always doing. No one owns a patent on it. It's something your brain can do all the time. And your brain is going to work hard in this situation where your ears are unbalanced to get them back into balance. When your dizziness is caused by unilateral hypofunction, the compensation process or that neuroplasticity process is usually very straightforward and linear, and most people compensate within the first couple of months. So when it comes to neuritis and labyrinthitis, typically the diagnosis is made based on symptoms alone because people are usually so ill during that period of time that testing can't be done. Right after that acute phase, though, is a great time for audiological testing. And the reason I say this is because it can be really helpful to have some kind of diagnosis after that acute attack, because I often see people completely misdiagnosed with neuritis and labyrinthitis when their symptoms totally didn't match or they never had testing done at all. And when I say audiological testing, I don't mean a bedside physical therapy exam. As you guys know, I'm highly trained in vestibular therapy, and I love bedside exams to tell me about someone's actual function. But for the purposes of diagnosing an actual hypofunction, you really need objective testing, not something that someone can do in a physical therapy office. These tests can include things like VNG testing, which is video nystagmography, caloric testing, when the professional would put water or air into your ears to see if the ears are responding equally, rotary chair testing, which is another test using goggles, and V-HIT testing, among others. Now don't worry, many people in many parts of the world don't have access to these kinds of tests, and while it's really good to have an accurate diagnosis, the general rule of thumb is with a course of vestibular therapy, usually you will compensate for a unilateral hypofunction within a couple months. So whether you were able to get audiological testing done or not, that should be your expected course. And if it's not, that's when we need to start thinking about neural circuit dizziness. So if you haven't recovered within the expected framework, and/or you never were able to get testing done and your diagnosis was made because you were dizzy, yet you never even had that first big bang attack episode of really severe dizziness and nausea, or you've gone through what sometimes physical therapists will call decompensation, which means you went through a course of vestibular therapy, got better, and then suddenly your dizziness symptoms came back a few months later or a few years later. In all of these cases, we want to start to look at neural circuit dizziness potentially being a cause. Now, of course, I always want to mention the most important caveat here is I am assuming that you saw a medical physician or other health professional to help diagnose your dizziness first. But if the test came back normal, or you were indeed diagnosed with hypofunction and have not gotten better, or you've decompensated, in all of those cases, when there's no other medical explanation for your continued dizziness symptoms, this information that I'm about to give you may apply to you. So my question in all of these cases, if you have persistent symptoms, if you've decompensated, if you were diagnosed with this hypofunction but don't actually have laboratory evidence that you have it, why has your brain not compensated for what's gone on? And I feel like this is an important question that a lot of times doesn't get asked in regular office visits with a healthcare professional. If you did not compensate within the expected time, or you decompensated, why? My point of view is that it's actually a very metabolically expensive process to stay dizzy. In other words, it's actually making a lot more work for your brain to not be feeling balanced. And if you want evidence of this, just think about your energy levels when you have dizziness versus when you don't. You feel a lot more tired when you have dizziness because you're working your brain extra hard. So from my perspective, your brain is fighting to return to balance. And if it hasn't returned to balance, we really need to understand why. So this is where we want to start to come back to that biopsychosocial model of disorders. Up until now, we focused on these biological causes, this virus that attacked your ear, this inflammation that happened, the testing, the physical therapy. If none of those things explained or took away your symptoms, then it's time for us to look at the psychosocial factors that may be impeding your recovery. And on my channel, the psychosocial causes that I focus on are things relating to stress, emotions, and conflicts. Now, if you're new to my channel, that might be a very strange thing to hear, but let me explain it to you this way. Your brain always responds to threat with a physical reaction. And sometimes it may be responding to an actual threat. So if there's a car coming towards you really quickly, you're gonna get that burst of adrenaline and you're gonna move out of the way. But your brain can have that same exact response to thoughts, emotions, or sensations. If you're under a lot of stress, if you're dealing with internal conflict, if you don't feel free to express your emotions, if you take on a lot of other people's burdens, and these are all factors I've talked about a lot on my channel, your brain can respond to those things with that exact same physical reaction to threat. In other words, your brain doesn't understand necessarily the nuance between getting out of the way of a car and dealing with a difficult situation in your personal life. But here's what we do know. When your brain is in threat mode, it functions very differently from when it's not in threat mode. First of all, it doesn't have the resources it needs in order to heal and rewire this new response that your brain needs to balance your ears back out. But also, a brain that's in threat mode is much more likely to associate other non-threatening things with threat. In other words, it's more likely to make bad predictions that something is threatening even when it's not. So in other words, if your brain is stuck in threat mode, it's going to have a much harder time compensating for some kind of vestibular dysfunction. Here's an example from everyday life that might explain this. If you've had a really bad day and you got yelled at by your boss and you got stuck in traffic and it was just kind of a bad day all around, you get home and your loved one picks a fight with you, how are you going to respond to that fight? Not too well, right? You're going to immediately get riled up or shut down. What if you've had an amazing day? What if you had a day where you felt connected, you felt effective, you felt like things were going great for you, and then you came home and a loved one picked a fight with you? It would be a really different response, wouldn't it? So my point here is that the way your brain responds to this need to compensate to this vestibular event is going to be very heavily affected by the other things going on in your life at the time. And I've broken this down in many of my other videos, so I'll link to some below where you can learn a little bit more about what I mean by stress, conflicts, and the threat response. But the takeaway is this. If you've been diagnosed with a vestibular hypofunction, neuritis, or labyrinthitis, whether you've had testing confirm it or not, you should typically be feeling better within, at the maximum, about 3 months. If you're not feeling better, if vestibular therapy didn't help, then first you should make sure that there's nothing medical that explains this persistent symptom. But if all the medical things have been ruled out, we're probably looking at something related to, again, these psychosocial factors and potentially neural circuit dizziness. And again, you can learn more about what that means and how to know if you have it by watching some of the videos I will put in the video description here. I hope that was helpful for you guys. And if you liked this video, please like, share, subscribe, comment. I look forward to hearing your questions and I will talk to you guys soon. Take care.